Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me for my regular updates from our capital. Actually, been a challenging week, but a good mood today because we did our annual where we bring in kids from a local school. We had 32 second through fifth graders from Wayanoke School in Fairfax County that came in and helped decorated our very, very tallest Christmas tree we've ever had in the office from down from Mount Rogers in Southwest Virginia. So that put me in a beginning of the holiday spirit. Of course, I've done no shopping and I've got lots to do. So that was a good news piece. Let me now resort to going through 4 items before we go to questions. Let me go back to my Grinch attitude, which is, you could almost plug and play my comments that I'm about to make. We're 2 weeks away, 15 days away actually, from a potential government shutdown. Why we go through this whole process, why we are not finishing the balance of government spending for this year that started literally October 1st, the beginning of the fiscal year. And as you've heard me say repeatedly, there is no state hurt worse from a government shutdown than Virginia, worse even than DC or Maryland. What it does, particularly in terms of the kind of just stress it puts on our federal workforce, and in terms of anticipation, in terms of our government contracting workforce, in terms of folks going into the holidays. Now, I think we're going to get this done. Most of this holdup is not Democrat-Republican. It's internal House Republicans fighting each other and where we kick it over to. But again, I won't go on at length. You can go back and replay 47 different times my comments about how dreadful government shutdowns are to a state like Virginia, and how even the so-called continuing resolution, which we will do until I believe the date is now March, still costs the taxpayer an enormous amount of money, and particularly for a state like ours that is so dependent upon defense spending and our ship repair industry, which I'll be with in the next 2 weeks down in Hampton Roads. If you're working off last year's budget, you can't even start on a new ship repair if it's plugged into this year's budget as opposed to last. But it does not appear that we'll actually do that. But the fact that we're going down to this deadline is just an exercise that just incredibly frustrates me. Second issue is the question of some of the new president's policy proposals that he's put out. He's talked a lot about tariffs, and I know Mr. Trump has said tariffs is a great word. I hope Americans realize that a tariff is basically a tax on a good that comes from another country. And 95% plus of the time, that tax that's put on that product coming in is simply passed on to the consumer. Now, every party has, and the president has used tariffs in a selected way, so this is not Democrat-Republican, to go after select industries where there may be cheating or the balance of trade is so out of whack. But when President-elect Trump says he's going to do across the board, in some cases 100, 200% tariffs, or even the 20%, 25% he's talking about, for example, with Canada, our biggest trading partner. What that means is, for example, if you buy an iPhone for $650, it may end up being, $800. If you buy your kid a bike that maybe only costs $45, if it's imported, it's now going to cost $60, and that's at the low end of the tariff proposal. So selected use, particularly against a country like China and some of the national security areas, count me in. An across-the-board tariff, regardless of whether the country is an ally or a foe, that's going to drive inflation, that's going to drive costs up, and folks just need to understand what is potentially coming. Third item, and this is something I've raised at the national level and raised with you guys before. We had another brief yesterday on this across all 100 senators, and this is the massive salt typhoon Chinese hack of all our telecommunication systems. It is particularly egregious for the greater Washington area, where over 1 million phone numbers where data was scraped. It meant in the past that China could actually listen to your cell phone call or read your text. Now that's if they selected you, and the number selected so far has been relatively small. But as I've said repeatedly, the barn door is still open. They are still in our systems, and their ability to then select, and now not just in the greater DC area, we've found them across virtually every major telecom network. They are burrowed deep, and that means that anyone who they select, and this goes at national security issues, which I'm gravely concerned about, it is still a problem. I'm working with folks on both sides of the aisle. There's nothing partisan about this issue. We have to raise minimum cyber security standards within our telecom industry. Now, related to that, there was an announcement, I believe just yesterday or the day before, that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, came out with where they identified 2 data brokers, unfortunately one located here in Virginia, where these data brokers collect information, sometimes that they can literally buy from entities, and sell it. And some of that information may include where you go to the doctor, where you worship, where your location is. And this kind of sale, not from a foreign entity, but literally from companies in America, of our personal information with these data brokers, we really need to step up and restrict that. It makes no sense. I know many of us kind of assume, well, all our information is looked at, but in the United States of America, we have a right to privacy where we shouldn't have undue commercial or, for that matter, governmental interference unless we agree. This is a national security issue. It's a privacy issue. And obviously in the case of information about where or how often you go to the doctor, where or how often you worship, or other locations, it really impinges on our rights. A final issue, before we go to questions, on a slightly better note, both good news, bad news story. Good news is last night we passed a small tax bill that will go to the president right now that will allow victims of Hurricane Helene, I think about our folks in Southwest Virginia, to write off part of their expenses of rebuilding. I mean, that's good news. The bad news is we, Congress, have still not done our job in terms of refilling the bucket, for example, of the Small Business Administration funding so that people who've qualified for loans can get their loans. And again, this isn't charity. This is why you pay your taxes. And it is, Tom Tillis and I, and working with Tim and Morgan and others, we tried to get it fast-tracked so we can get that loan money out. And then there is also a dispute coming out of the House where we've got to make sure the FEMA disaster package, which I believe will be included and will provide the SBA money, although each week that goes on, that business is going to have a harder time rebuilding if they don't get the loan they've got the right to. But as we know, whether you live around the Blue Ridge Parkway or particularly, as we think in Washington County, in terms of the Creeper Trail, a lot of that was on U.S. Forest Service lands. It could literally take hundreds of millions of dollars to rebuild the Creeper Trail. That is an economic lifeline as well as one of the jewels of Virginia. If the Forest Service and public lands money is left out of the disaster relief package, and this is, again, not partisan, the Democrats and Republicans in the Senate agree on that. There's some concern coming from the House. That is, that means particularly the future of the Creeper Trail, if it's put off for another month or year before you get the funding that is deserved. These are public lands. It's on Forest Service lands. Would be a real shame. And we are fighting tooth and nail to make sure it gets included. The people of Southwest Virginia are strong. They rally in the aftermath of disasters. I visited 10 jurisdictions in the immediate aftermath. Folks are tough. They're resilient. But we owe our fellow Virginians the willing to stand up for them, as well as obviously the literally millions of people in North Carolina in particular who've been hard hit. So more to come on that issue. With that, Laura, I'll turn it over to you and be happy to start taking your questions.
Senator, our first question is Bill Atkinson with the Petersburg Progress Index.
Good afternoon, Senator. Always nice to be with you, and I hope that I'm not adding too much to your Grinch list with this question. But given that President-elect Trump's first choice for defense secretary appears to be in trouble, there are reports he's considering Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for the position, and your colleague Senator Kaine this morning said that Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa also is being floated. Given the fact that all of the president-elect's past and current cabinet choices come with a whole lot of political alignments with him, what effect do you think either Pete Hegseth, Governor DeSantis, or Senator Ernst would have on Virginia's military communities and commissions in the next administration?
One, it's a fair question, and and I would argue the question you talk about Virginia's military is critically important, and the independence of our military and the non-politification of our military. But I'm also watching, as chairman of the Intelligence Committee, about an equal concern I have about the politicization of our intelligence community. I mean, the role of the intelligence community is to speak truth to power, even if the power doesn't want to hear the truth. And if that gets politicized, we are in a heap of trouble. So, I've followed in the press the Secretary of Defense potential challenges. I think there's a lot of my Republican senators who are friends who are really unsettled. I don't have the slightest idea who, if he were to withdraw, who President Trump would pick. I thought I would be used to his surprises, but a lot of these choices have literally surprised me. And it is these jobs, Secretary of Defense, Director of National Intelligence, they are extraordinarily serious jobs, and they require serious people who you shouldn't be ruled out for being a partisan by any means. Both sides have appointed former senators, for example, as Secretary of Defense. But once you take these positions, your obligation has to be to the Constitution, and particularly when we're talking about the military and the intelligence community, to maintain its independence. That has been the strength of our nation. We see countries all over the world that I think for a long time Americans said could never happen here, where the military becomes the pawn of a political party, and they usually end up with coup after coup. American military has never been party to those kind of activities. I think it is probably the most essential characteristic of this new administration that we keep our military independent and that we keep our intelligence community independent. And for that matter, I should also put in, obviously, the Department of Justice. When those become simply tools of a political agenda, our country's got real problems.
Senator, our next question is Elizabeth Beyer with the Cardinal News.
Hi, Senator. Thank you so much for your time today. So both you and Senator Kaine have pushed for the Hurricane Helene disaster supplemental to be voted on in the first week of December. So I'm hoping you can provide a status update on that bill.
Well, yeah, absolutely. This is the bill where even before this, Senator Kaine, Senator Tillis, and I said, let's at least refill the Small Business Administration's funding so that people who've been approved for loans get those loans. It's so disrespectful that folks who got hit with this hurricane months ago are still waiting for their loans. They've been approved. The bigger package about refilling not only the SBA, but Department of Agriculture, FEMA, and as I mentioned at the outset, the really critical part of the Forest Service and our public lands. If we leave the problems on the Blue Ridge Parkway, if we leave the problems on the Creeper Trail, which is all Forest Service land, then those communities aren't going to be able to be rebuilt. The numbers are big. I think the total of Forest Service lands, FEMA, et cetera, is almost $115 billion. Could you cut that a bit? Yeah, I'm willing to really, cut some of that. But the idea that, if some have suggested in the House, well, let's just kick this over until the next president comes in, Particularly when I think about Southwest Virginia that overwhelmingly supported President-elect Trump. What kind of message that sent? Now, I know in the Senate, the Democrats and Republicans, there are a few outliers, but the vast majority of us want to get this done at the best number possible. And we have to get it done before the Christmas break. I wish I could say the same in the House. I've talked to my Virginia colleagues in the House, Republican colleagues. I think they're all in. But so much of this around disaster relief is tied up with some of the far-right crowd in the House, and with the Speaker having such a small margin in the House, and he has to get elected again as Speaker in early January. I hope that kind of internal House Republican politics does not delay this needed assistance. And again, I've said it a dozen times, this assistance to Virginians and Southwest Virginians in particular in need is not charity. It is your right as an American. It's what we pay taxes for, and it would be disgraceful if that got kicked over into the new year.
Senator, our next question is Rachel Branning with WSCT.
Hi, Senator. Thank you so much
Hey,
for
Rachel.
taking time to speak with us today. So we've seen reports that the White House is considering preemptive pardons for people like Fauci, Cheney, and Adam Schiff. Is this something that you would agree with?
I wouldn't agree with it. I was disappointed that President Biden went back on his own commitment. I understand that as a dad, those feelings, but he made so many times that he wasn't going to do it. And the idea that we're going to just do more to undermine the public's faith and rule of law. Am I concerned about how President-elect Trump might weaponize the Justice Department? Yes, but I also am concerned that having been in this Capitol on January 6th, when it was brutally attacked and law enforcement officers were wounded and a few actually died in the aftermath. You do this and then suddenly there's a blanket pardon to everybody on January 6th. That was an insurrection. And then going forward, a lot of folks in our country have lost faith that our federal government is really looking out in a fair way, and that everybody ought to be treated the same under law. I think the pardon power should be only used in extraordinary circumstances. I had that power as governor. I remember one time commuting to life imprisonment, somebody who was on death row because the evidence had been tampered with. But I spent a lot of sleepless nights just over that one issue and that one incident. And, the notion of willy-nilly going out and pardoning or preemptively pardoning or back and forth, for most Virginians, for most Americans, it just says some people get treated a totally different way than everyone else, and that's not good for our system.
Senator, our
Thank
next
you,
question
Senator.
is Brendan Ponton with WTKR.
My question was addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, Brennan.
We're going to move on to Margaret Barthel with WAMU.
Hi, Senator. Thanks for taking our questions. I'm curious to hear how you are thinking about the Trump incoming administration's sort of proposals to cut the federal workforce. Obviously, this is, I don't have to tell you that this is an issue of much concern among, residents in the D.C. region who are federal workers or who live with them or who, just work alongside them in their communities. And I'm particularly curious, how you are thinking about like what that actual, like when and where Congress would get to weigh in on some of those types of decisions to, move agencies out of D.C. or to, significantly curtail their workforces?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm an advocate for greater government efficiency. I'm very proud of the fact that when I was governor of Virginia, we got named best managed state. And we did a lot of things like changing our procurement processes, trying to bring more technology. Count me in on government efficiency. And I think there are clearly ways in the federal government where I've seen a lot of inefficiency. But the idea, and you've heard Mr. Ramaswamy and Mr. Musk, particularly Mr. Ramaswamy, say, he's not really looking for efficiency. He's just trying to cut the federal government for the sake of cutting. That is the opposite of bringing efficiency. The vast majority of federal workers could make a lot more money if they had dedicated their careers maybe on the private sector side. They do this out of a sense of public service. The idea that you're going to cut out wide swaths of the Justice Department or individuals who've worked in the defense area. And we're talking about not just federal workers, but government contractors. And, that undermines efficiency. And the idea, the ridiculous idea, let's take the intelligence community, which most of it is located in the greater capital area. The ability for somebody from the CIA to go to the NSA or get over to the NGO or NRO and do that with a 20-minute drive as opposed to flying across the country, and that ability to collaborate. You look at successful companies, they're more about co-locating, to bring about efficiency. This to me sounds like it's political mischief. It sounds to me that it's kind of an attack against the federal workforce. And if there's not proven efficiency, me and others will stand up against this. And I've been urging my friends in the business community, who particularly were supporters of President Trump, to go to this administration and say, dismiss what the effect it would have on our DMV region, which would be devastating, or what effect it would have potentially on Hampton Roads, which would be devastating. But just think from a business standpoint, eliminating some of your most experienced folks who've got that. You can't replace that overnight. And an AI tool alone is not going to substitute. I know there was real concerns. He's going to try to get rid of the Department of Environmental lawyers. Well, who's going to defend the United States government when somebody sues the American government if you don't have experienced people? So efficiency, count me in. Hacking off a government workforce just to try to drive down numbers, or because you've got a vendetta against people who've committed their life to public service, whether it be in the public sector as government workers. For that matter, I count a lot of folks, particularly from the military, who still support our nation on the private sector government contractor side. Count me as a stalwart opponent against those.
Senator, our next question is Mark Gadd with CBS 19.
Hey, Senator, thanks so much for your time. I just had a question about the proposed bill to build a new road up in Wintergreen for evacuation purposes that you and Senator Kaine and Congressman Bob Good have come into agreement with. Can you tell me a little bit more about the motivation behind that and why it took so long?
Well, first of all, why it takes so long is a great question. You've only got one access up to Wintergreen. I've spent a lot of time at Wintergreen. It's a beautiful spot. But you have a massive flood or fire. How's public safety going to get up there with just that one access and egress? So Congressman Good, Tim Kaine, and I have said, let's go ahead and force the Forest Service to go ahead and take some of the existing trail roads and turn that into a thoroughfare that particularly emergency vehicles could use. This is common sense. It's long overdue. And I think there's always been this tension. The Forest Service And I know on one hand I'm saying we got to make sure they get the money to rebuild the Creeper Trail. They have a public service in maintaining the natural beauty of the Forest Service, but at some point you got to have practical implications. If you've got people, physical structures, all at Wintergreen, potentially in harm's way with only one road in and out, and you've got the ability to have another access that would not destroy the natural beauty, do it. And frankly, it shouldn't even have taken a bill from Congress to have it happen.
Senator, our next question is Nick Minnick with WJLA.
Hey, sir. Hope you're doing well. Hope you can hear me, too.
Yeah.
All right. So taking a look at President Trump's DEA pick, he dropped out. So the president's looking at some other options. One of the names he's considering is Loudoun County Sheriff Mike Chapman. Mr. Chapman started his career in law enforcement at Howard County Police Department in Maryland. He worked at the DEA for 23 years in many different positions, and he served as sheriff of Loudoun County for the last 12 years. What do you think of Sheriff Chapman? Do you think he's qualified to lead the DEA? And is he someone you could see yourself supporting, confirming to lead the DEA?
Listen, I've met Sheriff Chapman. I've got an amicable relationship with him. And of course, as with all of these nominees, I think you got to treat a president's picks with respect, but you also got to do a due diligence process. It's why on all these positions, and clearly Sheriff Chapman's got a lot of good background in this area, but that's why in all of these, you got to have an open process. You got to do a background check. You got to have a public hearing, not just for our job, but frankly, the American public is owed that, particularly when we're talking about these major positions. So, again, I had not heard that suggestion, but as I said earlier in the interview, Donald Trump is always coming through with surprising picks, and I know the first individual dropped out. But I have worked well with Sheriff Chapman in his office over the years.
Senator, our final question is Amy Knowles with the Virginia Dogwood.
Hey, Senator Warner, thanks for taking our questions. I saw pictures of the professional tree decorators you mentioned being in your office this morning. I wondered if you could talk a little more about that experience and why it's important for people to engage in their government no matter their age.
Well, Amy, first of all, thank you so much for coming to the women's conference a few weeks ago in Roanoke, where we had over 700 women from around the state. And again, it was all free, and it was kind of about how you engage, how you connect, and appreciate you coming as a journalist to that event. This started more than a decade ago. We'd bring in the Christmas tree, and we'd invite kids from different schools. The kids are always excited. They're a little intimidated. We're usually getting them all from 2nd grade to 5th grade. This was, again, a Title I school, so most of the kids were on free or reduced lunch, so they come from, more challenging economic families. You could see their eyes get big as they came into my office, and the tree, the tree's the biggest tree we've ever had. I think it's 18 feet tall. We've not figured out how to get a star on the top of it yet. But to see kids come in and they all make handmade decorations, it's really cool. And one of the reasons I'm a little bit in a better mood is because that got me excited. I will have to tell you though, when I got them talking, because they were pretty shy at first, they would come in groups. We had 32 of them. When I said, well, what can I do for you? I get to help make laws, and what laws would you like me to pass? And not saying that they were just like any other interest group, but they, didn't ask for world peace. They didn't ask to, trim the deficit. They said, one suggested banning homework. The other said more recess. A third said longer holidays. So, I guess, lobbying self-interest in America starts pretty young everywhere, but it was a great time to be with them, and it's one of my favorite days of the year. Thanks for asking, Amy. And thank you, everybody. We'll get at least one or two more of these in before the holidays come fully crashing down. Thanks, everyone.